Heathrow Airport has a major problem. It's one of the most important airports on Earth, handling more than 84 million passengers a year and connecting Britain with hundreds of destinations around the world. But almost every one of those flights depends on just 2 runways. 2. Heathrow handles more flights than any other 2-runway airport in the world, and for years it has been operating at or close to its limits. Airlines desperate to grow at Heathrow can't simply add another flight. New airlines can't necessarily get the slots they want, and when something goes wrong, there isn't a huge amount of spare capacity available to absorb the disruption. Meanwhile, Heathrow's competitors have been getting bigger, and this summer something happened that would have been almost unthinkable a few years ago. Heathrow lost its position as Europe's busiest airport. In July 2026, 7.86 million passengers travelled through Heathrow. Istanbul handled 8.15 million. After dominating European aviation for most of the last 3 decades, Heathrow had been overtaken. Now Britain wants to fight back. The plan is an enormous £49 billion transformation of Heathrow, including a 3rd runway, new terminals, hundreds of thousands of additional flights, and a section of one of Britain's busiest motorways literally being moved underneath the new runway. If it works, Heathrow could eventually handle as many as 150 million passengers a year. But Britain has been trying to build this runway for decades. So why does Heathrow need it so badly? What exactly do you get for £49 billion? And is Britain's biggest airport finally about to change forever? To understand why Heathrow is spending this kind of money, you have to understand what makes the airport different. Heathrow isn't simply somewhere Londoners go to catch a flight. It's a hub. Think of it as an enormous aviation interchange. A passenger might fly from Edinburgh into Heathrow and connect onto a British Airways 787 heading to Los Angeles. Someone else arrives from New York and connects to India. At the same time, cargo is being transferred onto aircraft travelling around the world. By combining passengers from dozens of different markets, airlines can support long-haul routes that might never work if they relied entirely on people travelling directly between 2 cities. That's why Heathrow is so valuable. In 2025, it was once again ranked the world's most connected airport in OAG's Mega Hubs Index. But being popular creates its own problem. Heathrow is basically full. The airport currently operates around 480,000 flights per year using 2 parallel runways. Paris Charles de Gaulle has 4. Amsterdam Schiphol has 6, although operational restrictions mean they're not all used simultaneously in the same way. Denver has 6, and Istanbul has been expanding aggressively. Heathrow has spent decades squeezing an extraordinary amount of aviation into a relatively small piece of land west of London. You can actually see this in the value of its slots. A slot is essentially an airline's permission to take off or land at a particular time. At an airport with spare capacity, that's not necessarily remarkable. At Heathrow, it's incredibly valuable. If there isn't a slot available at 8 in the morning, an airline can't simply create one. That's why individual Heathrow slot transactions have historically been worth tens of millions of pounds. There is only so much space, and Heathrow believes it has finally run out. So here's the plan. Heathrow wants to build a 3rd runway northwest of the existing airport. And this isn't some small strip designed for regional aircraft. The proposed runway could be up to 3,500 metres long, enough to accommodate the aircraft Heathrow needs for its global operation. More importantly, Heathrow says it could allow the airport to increase from roughly 480,000 flights per year to as many as 756,000. That's potentially another 276,000 flights every year. Break that down and you're talking about roughly 750 additional aircraft movements every single day. Imagine what that does to Heathrow. More British Airways flights, more international carriers, more frequencies on existing routes, potentially entirely new destinations that airlines currently can't justify using one of Heathrow's extremely valuable slots to serve. Heathrow says expansion could unlock at least 30 additional daily routes and ultimately increase capacity to as many as 150 million passengers per year. But here's what's interesting. The runway itself is only part of the £49 billion. Around £21 billion is earmarked for the runway and associated airfield infrastructure. Another £12 billion would go towards new terminal and aircraft stand capacity. and roughly £15 billion is associated with modernising the existing airport. In other words, Britain isn't simply getting another runway, it's effectively rebuilding Heathrow around it. One of the biggest changes would happen around Terminal 5. Anyone who flies British Airways regularly probably knows T5. It's opened in 2008 and has essentially become BA's home at Heathrow. Under the expansion, Heathrow wants to build a major new terminal complex west of the existing building called T5X, along with additional satellite facilities closer to the new runway. Terminal 2 would also expand. The central terminal area would be redeveloped, and eventually, Terminal 3 would close. That's significant because Terminal 3 is a piece of aviation history. It opened in 1961 as the Oceanic Terminal, and over the decades has seen everything from early jetliners and Concorde to 747s, A380s, and today's 787s and A350s. Under this plan, it could eventually disappear as Heathrow reorganises itself for a completely different level of traffic. Heathrow also wants to increase cargo capacity by around 50%. Look underneath many of those passenger 777s, A350s and 787s, and they're carrying far more than suitcases. They're moving pharmaceuticals, electronics, components, and other high-value goods between Britain and the rest of the world. But before Heathrow can build any of this, it has to deal with something rather inconvenient. Look at where the new runway is supposed to go, and you'll notice something. There's a motorway in the way. And not some tiny local road, it's the M25. Heathrow's solution is extraordinary. A section of the motorway would be realigned and lowered, with the new runway passing over it. The plan is to build the replacement section while the existing motorway continues operating. Eventually, traffic would be moved onto the new alignment. Aircraft would then literally be taking off and landing above one of Britain's busiest roads. And this gives you an idea of why a Heathrow runway can cost £21 billion. You're not building in the middle of a desert, you're trying to insert a major new runway into one of the most developed parts of Britain. There are motorways, communities, businesses, and existing airport infrastructure everywhere. Hundreds of homes could ultimately be affected, and some would need to be purchased and demolished. There are also serious questions about aircraft noise, because Heathrow has another problem you can't solve with £49 billion. London is directly underneath many of its flight paths. Heathrow began developing into London's main civilian airport after the Second World War, long before anyone imagined it handling 150 million passengers. Then commercial aviation exploded. London grew, Heathrow grew, and eventually the city and the airport became locked together. Because Britain's prevailing winds are generally from the southwest, aircraft frequently approach Heathrow from the east, taking them directly over London. For an aviation enthusiast, it's fantastic. Stand in the right part of the city and you can watch everything from an A380 to a 777 or 787 descending overhead every couple of minutes. For people living underneath those flight paths, it's understandably more complicated. More flights can mean more noise. There are air quality concerns, climate targets, and communities that have spent years wondering whether their homes will eventually be swallowed by airport expansion. That's one reason the third runway has become one of Britain's most controversial infrastructure projects. And this is definitely not a new idea. Serious proposals for Heathrow expansion have been bouncing around British politics for decades. A third runway was backed by Gordon Brown's government in 2009. David Cameron cancelled it after becoming Prime Minister. The issue returned again. Boris Johnson opposed the idea so strongly that he once threatened to lie down in front of the bulldozers. Parliament backed expansion in 2018. Then came court battles over Britain's climate commitments. And still no runway. Britain even seriously considered building an enormous new airport in the Thames estuary, the famous Boris Island idea. But the cost and complexity were staggering, and Britain kept coming back to the same problem. Heathrow already has the passengers, it already has the airlines, it already has the connecting network. The problem is fitting more aircraft into it, and Heathrow doesn't have the luxury of pretending its competitors aren't moving. Look at Istanbul. Its new airport only fully opened in 2019, yet in July 2026, it handled around 8.15 million passengers and overtook Heathrow for the month. That comparison is fascinating. Heathrow is an airport whose roots stretch back to the earliest days of mass commercial aviation. Istanbul is effectively a purpose-built mega hub for the modern era. It has room to grow and a huge connecting airline in Turkish Airlines, feeding passengers between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Dubai has built another enormous connecting operation around Emirates. Paris has Air France, Amsterdam has KLM, Frankfurt has Lufthansa, Heathrow has British Airways, but BA is trying to grow around an airport where additional slots are incredibly difficult to obtain. These aren't simply airports competing for passengers. They're giant connecting machines, competing to decide where the world's passengers change planes. And if Heathrow can't grow while everyone else does, that's the real danger. Not that Heathrow suddenly becomes empty, quite the opposite. The danger is that Heathrow remains completely full, while future growth goes somewhere else. That's what this £49 billion rescue is really about. Heathrow says the expansion will be privately financed. But that doesn't mean passengers are completely insulated from the cost. Heathrow charges airlines to use the airport, and the Civil Aviation Authority regulates those charges. In July 2026, the CAA decided Heathrow could recover up to £320 million in early expansion costs incurred during 2025 and 2026 through airport charges, subject to safeguards. The CAA estimates this could initially add around 15 pence per passenger to the maximum airport charge in 2028, rising to an estimated 30 pence in subsequent years. That doesn't sound dramatic on a single ticket, but the bigger battle is what happens when a project costing tens of billions actually gets underway. Airlines want more Heathrow capacity. What they don't necessarily want is Heathrow becoming dramatically more expensive to use in order to pay for it. And that disagreement has already become significant. A rival proposal backed by Surinder Arora's Heathrow West offered a different approach with a shorter runway and lower projected cost. The government ultimately chose Heathrow Airport Limited's Northwest Runway proposal as the basis for its policy review. But the disagreement tells us something important. Almost everyone can see Heathrow has a capacity problem. Getting everyone to agree on how to solve it is much harder. As of August 2026, Heathrow still does not have permission to simply start building. The government has published its draft Heathrow expansion national policy statement. Think of this as the rulebook against which a future planning application will be judged. Expansion will have to satisfy major tests involving economic growth, climate, air quality, and noise. The current public consultation runs until September 1st, 2026. The government is targeting a final planning decision in 2029. If everything goes to plan, the ambition is to have the new runway operational around 2035. But we've just spent several minutes explaining what happens to Heathrow expansion plans when everything goes to plan. We know that might not be the case. £49 billion could give Heathrow another runway, enormous new terminal capacity, hundreds of thousands of additional flights, and room for airlines to finally grow. It could also become one of the most expensive and controversial airport projects Britain has ever attempted. After decades of proposals, political U-turns, and legal battles, the question isn't really whether Heathrow could use another runway, it's whether Britain can actually build it. And if the first aircraft really does touch down on Heathrow's third runway in the 2030s, it won't just be another runway opening. It will be the biggest change to Britain's most important airport in generations. Do you think Heathrow needs the third runway? Or has Britain waited too long while airports like Istanbul and Dubai raced ahead? Let me know in the comments.